Thank you very much for everyone for joining our Boardroom Bytes at 9 this morning. We hope everyone enjoys the session. We are very excited to be launching this new webinar series, and I'm very proud to say that this series will continue into the future. So you can look out for this every Wednesday at 9 o'clock. It gives me great pleasure to announce our speaker for this morning. Our topic is crisis communication for boards, and our speaker today is Regine Leroux. Regine founded Reputation Matters in 2005, and she developed the Reputometer, which was one of the first tools to help quantify organizations' reputation. So Regine is quite experienced in communication and reputation management, and she's helped a lot of organizations understanding and assessing their reputation. So Regine is going to go through with us today some really hot tips in what to ensure you have in place when you're looking at crisis communication. I hope you enjoyed the session, everybody. I'm going to now log off and I will hand you over to Regine. One more note from me: at the end of the session, when you leave, there will be an option for you to do an event survey for us. Please, can you take 1 minute to complete that survey? We would like your feedback. I've included an option in there for you to also give some topic suggestions for us so that we can consider what you would like to hear in these sessions. So please enjoy. We're going to have 30 minutes of presentation, and then Regine will open up the Q&A session thereafter. So Regine, over to you.
Thanks, Vicky, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to the session on crisis communication. I'm going to be sharing some of the habits, 9 habits of successful communicators during a crisis, and I think it's quite an apt time, obviously, with what we're facing at the moment. I mean, for the first time since the digital age, the entire world is faced with the same health pandemic crisis threat. It's such a magnitude that no textbook could ever have fully prepared us for this. So regardless of your location, the type of business that you have, whether it's small, a multinational conglomerate, all the steps that goes into managing your crisis from a communications point of view are very similar. The same habits need to be followed, and that's what I'm going to share with you this morning. So there's 9 specific habits that we look at. First and foremost, in the ideal world, habit number 1 is to have a plan in place. So that's obviously the ideal to have that plan. So what does that plan look like? Ideally is to have scenario-based planning where you have a workshop with your team members, with depending on how large your organization is, with key people from different areas of the organization. So be it somebody from the IT department, someone in operations, in HR, to help identify key specific crisis scenarios, because the crisis that we find in the IT department will be very different to what we'll find in the HR department. From there is to then ascertain the level of the risk. How likely is it to happen? Is this crisis something which is highly likely to happen? And how high does it rate in terms of impacting the reputation of the organization? So to then pretty much have 4 different categories, identify, let's say for argument's sake, category A, high likelihood of happening and a high risk to the reputation of the organization, all the way down to a category D, very unlikely to happen and not a very high risk to the organization. From there, to then ascertain for each of those specific categories, who are the key stakeholders that we need to communicate to? How are we going to be communicating to each of them, as well as what are the key messages that we need to deal with? So the minute that there's a crisis, everybody should be on the same page and know exactly who needs to communicate what to whom. Depending again on the organization, it might be quite helpful to have a flow chart, perhaps even at the receptionist's desk. If, for example, a journalist phones with a specific request, this is the line of command, this is the line of communication that needs to be followed. At minimum, the key stakeholders that you want to take into consideration for your plan is first and foremost your employees. The last thing that you want is for your employees to hear about a specific crisis situation via the radio or the media. You need to also be prepared in terms of how to communicate to customers, shareholders, and then the media as well. So linking it to the current pandemic, no one anticipated the extent of its impact at all. And it's difficult to know how to plan for something like this. But at minimum, most organizations should have planned or be ready for a worst case scenario where offices would need to be vacated. That's step number one, is to have that plan in place. If we look at habit number 2, so the second habit of a highly successful crisis communicator is to have an identified spokesperson within the organization. Ideally, this person needs to be as high up in the organization as possible. When there's a crisis, people want to hear from the most senior person in the organization, be it the managing director, the CEO. Most people do have a designated spokesperson, but during a crisis, it's that top leader that people want to hear from. Then the last thing, so part of having that clear spokesperson on board as well and having that framework in place is you want to make sure that everybody knows the flow of communication. You don't want the newest person in your organization to be giving their version of the situation. So it's really, really important to have that spokesperson. With that said, again, depending on the nature of the crisis, it is really valuable to make sure that your whole directorship team is trained up when it comes to media training, because depending on the nature of the crisis, it might make sense for the HR director to be speaking about labor issues. You want your so each person has a specific area, and the person that's the expert in their specific area to be speaking on a specific topic. I'm quickly going to be asking a poll here, just in terms of media training. Have you ever attended media training? So I'm going to keep this open just for a little while. Right, there we go. Thanks. I can see that people are starting to attend that, because what you want to do with the media training, or the purpose of the media training as well, is to make sure that you're comfortable with all the different media scenarios that come your way, especially when there's a crisis. You're going to have many microphones shoved in your face, radio requests, and you want to be as confident and as comfortable with all the various questions that come your way. So it's really important to make sure that every person is going to be comfortable in front of the media. So thank you for taking some time to answer that. So it is quite interesting. I'm sharing the results here that interestingly, I think also through this current pandemic, it does show us just the need and to realize, are we prepared for a crisis situation? How ready are we when it comes to our communication with a specific crisis situation? So then, number 3, the third habit of a highly successful crisis communicator is to be able to show compassion and to be empathetic. Because it's really, really important to remember that in any crisis situation, you need to be empathetic. Whenever there's a crisis, people are going to be impacted. And we need to remember that we are all human at the end of the day. We're dealing with emotions. When there's a crisis, it's very often, is it going to impact my job? Is it going to impact my life? Is it going to impact my livelihood? So we do need to keep in mind that we need to be incredibly sensitive to the fact that we are dealing with people. I think we can all think back to the awful BP oil spill disaster. That interview, I think it's been played in all the case studies of what not to do, where the CEO just being interviewed, just saying he wants his life back. Couldn't have been one of the worst responses ever. So the first sentence when there is a crisis scenario is just to acknowledge the situation, to say we're really sorry that this has happened. Our thoughts are with those that have been impacted. I do understand and we do appreciate that very often things cannot be communicated or you can't accept responsibility, but it is still important to have that human factor that you take into consideration. The fourth element, or the fourth habit of a highly successful communicator is to have a very quick turnaround time. Timing is absolutely everything, especially when it's an uncertain time, and the communication behind it is absolutely key. So that's also when your plan comes into play, so that you know exactly who needs to communicate what to whom, what those key messages are. And it's also it's important to remember three key things when it comes to being responsive, because remember, a key audience for your communication are the media, and they work on their own timelines. They're not going to wait around for you to respond. So the quicker that you can engage with the media, the better. So the three things to remember when it comes to responding is, first and foremost, no comment is a comment, and it's possibly the worst comment you could give. People will make up their own comments, so where there's that empty space that you say there's no comment, people will fill in that gap with their own comment, which is incredibly dangerous. It's a massive risk, especially to your reputation. So the last thing that you want to do is say no comment. Give some kind of a response to the audience. Even if you can't say anything, if there's legal issues, then say, this is currently under investigation. We're currently exploring what has happened. We're trying to find out, just as long as people know that you're doing something about it. And no comment indicates that you're doing nothing about it and you're sitting back and waiting. And that really is a massive, massive risk. The second thing to remember, that there's no such thing as off the record. Because if we think about it, journalists are inundated with a massive amount of press releases, information, telephone calls, interviews on a daily basis. Now, if you're going to tell them this is off the record and then tell them the information, it is quite unrealistic to expect them to remember that that piece of information was off the record 3, 4 weeks, 5 months down the line. If you don't want it in the public space, do not communicate it. The third one, never lie. You will be caught out. So that's as simple as that. Having a look again at the current crisis situation that we have, one of the things, perhaps some of the things for you to consider as an organization, if you haven't already done so, is to keep the following messages in mind that you could potentially communicate. First of all is respecting, adhering to government decisions and guidelines that all South African companies have been requested to update their websites with the coronavirus information. So if you haven't updated your website yet, it's highly recommended that you have a chat to your IT guys to help you to put that information on your website. Also respect to the government in terms of adhering to the lockdown request. The other aspect to consider, communicating your office hours. Will the business be open? Will it be closed? The team's availability. Is the team going to be working remotely? Will the business still be operational? Contact information is really important. And then again, just to give the health advice throughout this duration of this pandemic, so that we can all play our role in seeing how best to flatten this curve. Then the fifth habit of a highly successful communicator is finding ways to keep stakeholders updated. And I think there's various items here, but in general, I think the South African government's response to COVID-19 has been a prime example of how it should be done, in terms of really communicating very quickly, making decisions, having this lockdown. I mean, it's not particularly pleasant for anybody, but it needs to be done, and it has been communicating and keeping the public updated throughout with the situation. And we're hearing from the highest, the president himself, very, very regularly in terms of what's happening, finding out and getting information, and we know it's a source that we can trust. So the government has been showing us that and keeping everybody updated with the information. The website, their website, the information shed is up to date. The sixth habit of a highly successful crisis communicator is they stick to their guns. The message needs to be clear and consistent. This is what you need to do. This will happen if you don't do it. And these are the consequences. So having very clear parameters of the consequences of what has happened. Consistency is absolutely key. Okay, in all respect, there was a little bit of a wobble regarding whether we can go running and taking our dogs for a walk. But for most part, the message has been clear. Unfortunately, well, it's PR fodder and crisis communication fodder of what happened with the lunch yesterday. For those who might have followed it on social media and saw it on the lunch, that's not sticking to your guns. And that is why it's so important to have clear messages, clear lines of communication, and to be responsible and be accountable for your actions. So sticking to your guns is really, really key. Then if we have a look at habit number 7 of a highly successful crisis communicator, is to keep it simple. It's to keep that information as short and sweet as possible. I think you'll agree with me. There have been so many newsletters from everyone. I mean, I don't think our inboxes have ever been so full of information, which in this instance is good because we need to get that message out there. But from a crisis communications point of view, we need to keep it short and sweet. We need to cut through the noise, give the key information right at the beginning of the piece of communication. If people want more information, they can then be sent to a website, they can be given a call center number, so that if people have specific questions, it is also important to perhaps work on and have a Q&A in place, because very often you're going to get people asking the same questions. So having that Q&A available on the website so that people can go and have a look at that. So it is important for that to be part of your process as well. Then number 8 that we look at when it comes to a successful crisis communicator is taking action. So it doesn't help just giving lip service. So it is going to be interesting to see what's going to happen to those ministers that had the lunch yesterday, and we'll be keeping an eye on that. But it really is important for the leadership to practice what they preach. It doesn't help saying one thing and then doing something totally different. So for example, what I found very interesting globally, especially now with this pandemic, we're told to have social distancing, physical distancing, but the next minute you see a press conference taking place with all the media and leadership all in one room. So that wasn't quite taking action and practicing what you're preaching. So it is really important, and especially from a leadership point of view, taking the lead on this and setting the example how things need to be done. Leaders need to talk the talk and set the example. And especially now, finding that balance between profitability for businesses who are committed to the employees' well-being, and also then demonstrating this and how they're going to be supporting their employees in the weeks and months to come. And then finally, habit number 9, which is really important as well, is to fact check absolutely everything. It is really, really key. As I've just mentioned, there's so much information out there. Besides all the emails, I don't know if you've also been receiving 1,000,001 WhatsApp messages from everyone, from all sources, from all over the continent. There's just so much information. But it is a criminal offense. And what we've also seen in this last 24 hours even, it's a criminal offense to share fake news. So make sure that you check the credibility of any piece of information before you share it. And most reliable sources are government websites and recognized research and educational institutions. WhatsApp, social media is not a reliable source. So make sure that you double check that and not contribute to the additional noise out there. Those are the key habits of highly successful crisis communicators. I actually also just want to add another poll, just to go back to step number 1. If you take all of these into consideration, do you have a communication policy in place for your organization? So let me quickly, a crisis communications policy. I'm launching that now. So let me know if you have a crisis communication policy in place. So while you're voting on that, so just to recap the 9 habits of highly successful communicators: have a plan in place, have an identified spokesperson or people that have been media trained in place, make sure that you are compassionate and show empathy, that's part of the key messages that form part of your communication and crisis communication strategy, have a quick turnaround time, find ways to keep your stakeholders up to date. And part of that is also to understand who your stakeholders are, especially in terms of knowing the different generations, for argument's sake. So whether your audience is a baby boomer, a Generation X, a millennial, or we've got new generation entering the workforce now, Gen Z, and each one of them have different preferences when it comes to communication. So making sure that we actually communicating to the different generations in the optimal way to make sure that we're getting that message across. Number 5, keeping ways to keep stakeholders up to date, sticking to your guns, keeping it simple, cutting through the noise, taking action, and then also fact-checking absolutely everything. So thank you for taking this poll. Let me quickly share the results with you. So it's also quite interesting that the majority of the participants don't currently have a communications policy in place. So I think some great time during this lockdown time to set some time aside with your teams to determine how best do we communicate from a crisis. First of all, having a communications policy and plan and strategy in place, and then linking that, making sure that there is a crisis strategy and plan in place for the organization. So I'm going to open the Q&A now, if you have any specific questions that you'd like answered. Right, there's some great questions coming through, so thank you for sharing them. So what about the overload? How do you balance the sufficient communication versus information overload? So I think, Ayanda, that's a really great question. It goes with part of making sure having feedback mechanisms in place as well. So as part of your communication strategy and plan, the more similar questions that you get asked, you know that there's a gap then, that you can then start putting a Q&A in place. Because also what you don't want to do is have so much information. As soon as somebody sees an email or communication from you, they then disregard it. So it is to have that fine balance between being over communicating and also just having too much. We had a communication policy, but not a crisis communication. We refer to this to risk management. Okay, so that's a great statement. So thank you. Yeah, so I think there's many terminologies around this. It could be a risk management policy. It could be communications. But I think what's really important is to have an overall communications policy that is for everyday use in terms of this is what you can say. Because as I mentioned earlier, the last thing that you want is for the newest person that just joined the the company to give their version of events. You also want to include in your communications policy what to do during a crisis, but also importantly, what you can and can't say on social media, because that very often could cause quite a massive crisis as well. So you have to have that etiquette, that protocols in place of what you can and can't say. When do you call, so next question, when do you call in a PR agency for help? I think it is important to invest in experts' advice to guide you through specific areas. And I think very often when it comes to public relations, it is such an underrated skill. Unfortunately, PR hasn't PR'd itself particularly well, but it is such an incredibly important component. You want to invest in the skills of how best to communicate, allowing you then to be able to run the business and do the things that you are an expert at. So it is as soon as you can invest in a PR agency or communications agency, I highly, highly recommend it. I think there's a great saying by Bill Gates. He said if he's down to his last $2, he would invest in public relations. Here's another great question. Which platforms do you recommend for communications? That's a great question from Ayanda. I think what's key here is understanding your different stakeholder groups. It's really important. Depends on each specific scenario. So very, very briefly, if we look at the baby boomer generation, who is your 50-year plus of age, generally, so this is very generally, enjoy more face-to-face interactions, prefers a phone call and a face-to-face meeting. Where you have Generation X, these are your 40-year-olds to just below 50, who prefer emails. They like to hide. They're generally the first people that open their laptop when they enter a meeting, a meeting room. They will WhatsApp. They not great, not massive fans of networking. The millennials love social media, WhatsApp. They pretty much function 24/7. Generally speaking, your baby boomers and your millennials, baby boomers and Generation X feel that the millennials do move and do hop around companies quite a lot. And then your new generation, your Generation Z, which is very interesting, they are again preferring the face-to-face. So we're seeing that coming back into the market. So that's just, again, understanding your different people that you are engaging with, so that needs to form part of how best to communicate to them. Guy, I like your question. Why are South Africans better at crisis management rather than management of the crisis? I think it depends from scenario to scenario, but I think that was more of a tongue-in-cheek comment. But yeah, it is quite interesting. Narcissa, how can boards receive the necessary media training? So there are some wonderful media training organizations out there who very often have ex-journalists on the teams to then take the directors through their paces. They bring in their cameras and they bring in a journalist that then pretty much put you through. Let's say, for argument's sake, you're sitting at your desk and all of a sudden a camera crew from Carte Blanche comes in. What do you do? So there's that role play and that scenario of how to deal with that. And I think it's really important to invest in that media training for your executives to be comfortable in front of the cameras, so that they know how to deal with any scenario, so that they don't accidentally say no comment. Okay, what is the role of the union during crisis communication? Should they form part of the crisis team or not? I think that's a really, really great question. And your unions play an incredibly important role during any communication scenario. So they do need to be included, absolutely, especially if it's an issue and a crisis regarding your employees. So it does, I remember years ago, we actually worked very closely when we wanted participation from employees, and nothing would happen without union buy-in. So your unions do need to form part of that crisis plan, that flow. And that again is why every single crisis communications plan and strategy is going to be unique for that specific organization. Each organization is going to have different stakeholders that are important to them. So that is when that workshop that I recommended earlier is so crucial, where you bring in key role players in terms of, this is the crisis, these are the stakeholders that we need to include. So for example, that is where the HR, everybody, it would then be able to say, well, if this happens, it's going to impact our employees. We have unions that we need to take into consideration. This is the person that we need to engage with. This is how best to get hold of them. And part of that, this whole exercise would then also be to make sure that your database is up to date, because it doesn't help to try and update your database, get cell phone numbers and email addresses when the crisis is happening. That needs to be up to date as well. This is a good question, Paul. What do you do when you don't have all the answers, but the media is anxious for a response? So important is you do need to answer the media. They work on their own timelines, and the last thing that you want is for them to print the spokesperson wasn't available for comment. That's happened to one of my clients years ago, and they hadn't gone to media training. Is to say to the media, give the media as much information as you possibly and legally can. So being able to give them a response of, it's currently being investigated. We're sorry about this, that this has happened. We acknowledge that the situation has happened. It's currently being investigated. And as soon as we have more information, we will make it available. And then to make sure you give that information and you keep that journalist up to date throughout the process. And as soon as you've got more information, you share it with them. Right, here's another question. Realistically speaking, at what stage should South Africa have started with a crisis management plan? In most cases, this seems to have been prompted by the president's address. How would you advise that we better prepare for such events? Fikile, I think that's a really great question. And I must admit, I think that we've realistically started dealing with this as soon as we possibly can. If we have a look at countries where the lockdown only started much, much later, and the significant amount of cases that they're dealing with versus where we are, yes, we're dealing with too many as it is, but in comparison, if we look at the stats, I think we have been managing this as quickly and as soon as we could have. I think most people do question some people say we should have done this earlier. They question whether there's so many questions around it. And as we've mentioned, this is of such a massive magnitude. No one really knows the outcome of all of this. There is no textbook to support us. But I think in terms of what and how we've reacted to it, it's definitely assisting to getting that to getting that curve down. How do you go about crafting a message that would suit a particular generation? I think that's a really great question, Jeffrey, and it depends on the scenario and the situation, and it depends on what that key message is that you need to communicate. And I think that goes back to that great question that we had earlier. When you start investing in a PR agency or communications agency, they will help you to craft the message so that people understand it. I think very often that also happens in organizations. You have incredibly, and especially in organizations where there's lots of technical information and highly, highly educated people, who then start formulating messages that's just too incomprehensible for people to understand. So your communications agency will help you to get that message to an understandable language. So it does differ, and that's again why it really helps to invest in experts to help you formulate the specific messages. Please comment on reputation damage if crisis communication is not successful. Andres, I think that's a really great question as well. So if we have a look at a reputation, if you've got a good reputation, people want to do business with you. They're willing to spend their hard-earned cash on your product or service, and there's a direct link with your good reputation with your bottom line. If your crisis is not managed sufficiently, then people are not going to be wanting to be associated with your brand, and there's going to be a direct link to your bottom line, and you're going to lose business. So if you don't deal with it quickly and effectively and credibly, then you basically stand the risk of having to close down your business. There's a great example, and to try and get your business back in terms of rebuilding that reputation is an expensive exercise. It's going to take a lot of money, a lot of resources, and a lot of time to rebuild it. So you want to be looking after your reputation. A reputation management is being proactive, looking after the health of your reputation. Similarly, as you would look after the health of your body, you need to be healthy to get through life. Similarly, you need to have a healthy reputation to get you through the journey of your business. So with a crisis, you're in reactive mode. You need to then be reactive. But if you have a good reputation, if you think of it, if you're healthy, you recuperate and you get better a lot quicker. If you've got a good reputation, you are going to be able to recuperate and get better from this crisis a lot quicker as well. Next question. Because of the uncertainty faced in trying to be consistent and also being compassionate, what is the best way to assure the employees about their future? Is it to give them the worst case scenario or to leave them with some assurance? Tembi, I think what's really important, again, and that links to what I said earlier, never lie. It's gonna backfire on you. We've all seen it. Too many people out there have lied, and it's just not worked out well for them. Is to assess what's realistic to communicate or not to communicate, because you do want to set people's minds at ease. I do think it is important to be transparent as far as possible, to say this is the scenario. You don't want to be fear-mongering, to say, you're all gonna have. So worst case scenario might not be the best case scenario, but also just to paint flowers and pictures and say everything's going to be okay is also not realistic. So it's how to authentically be as transparent as possible. Jonah, this is also a very good question. Who should take ownership of the communication and crisis? So ideally, you should have somebody, a communications department that manages the communication side of things. During a crisis, you need your leader, director, to be able to steer the ship through this crisis. So the communications needs to work hand in hand with the leadership team to steer through the crisis. And the reputation, the crisis needs to be dealt with at the highest level. And by walking the talk and by showing what needs to be done, that will then filter through to showing everybody within the organization how to deal and what to communicate. Is there specific PR and communication courses you recommend for directors? There is the Public Relations Institute in Southern Africa that have a number of courses and facilitators. I know that there are a number of courses through the universities as well. So there are quite a few really good courses out there for people to attend. Let's have a look. So these questions are awesome. This is really, really great. What is the right balance between quick turnaround and fact check? That's a great link between that, because you do want to give quick turnaround, but So instead of saying no comment, you can say that's something we're looking into. I don't have the facts with me right now, but I'll get back to you. So, and then you kind of buy yourself a little bit of time to be able to go and look for those facts. So if you know that you can get those facts, get them say that you'll go and look for them. If you can't find them, let the journalist know as well. Don't just keep quiet. And obviously, the minute you have them, go share that. Okay, so Dennis, this is an interesting question. Government in the case of Corona. Okay, my government in case of Corona has every minister giving. Okay, my government in case of Corona has every minister giving information to the public about how their ministers' services are structured during the lockdown. They also delve into Corona-specific issues. Doesn't that give room for dilution of messages? Yes and no. I think what's really important is, again, at the beginning of any crisis, is to have the confirmation of messages. And that's where your Q&A comes in. That's when you have, so basically, when you do have a crisis, so Corona is obviously a very, very specific crisis that everybody's dealing with. So whether it's Corona or whether it's another crisis scenario, you want to have a core crisis communications team. So the minute that there's a crisis, you call in your core crisis communications team into a boardroom or a virtual office if it's during lockdown at the moment, but you have your core people where you then confirm the facts. This is what's happened. This is what we can communicate. This is what we can't communicate. And these are, at minimum, for argument's sake, the three key things that we communicate. And those three things, regardless of who the minister is, should then be following that in their communication, because especially because of the nature and the size of this crisis, it's not realistic just to have one spokesperson. You need as many people sharing the same message. So that's where confirming the key messages up front are so incredibly important. Great. So how well do you think companies are communicating during this COVID-19 crisis that we find ourselves in? So that's a great question. I think initially a little bit of panic from everybody and just over communication. I think actually there's two parts of a bit of shock of not knowing what to communicate, should we be communicating, and then over communication. And I think we're going to also start seeing this flattening out a little bit. Probably also next week, less communication, panicked communication around this. But I do think South African companies have really taken this on so incredibly well and dealing with it in the best possible way that we possibly can. How will the company's social media policy need to be altered to align with the crisis communication policy, specifically during the lockdown period? So that is an interesting question and an important one, because social media does play such an important role in the communication. And I think now more than ever, it's really, really important to lock down, to have a policy in place, because you have your employees in front of their screens and not in the same office space. You're working from a virtual remote area where you can't, people are working from home, so they might be on social media a lot more, might be making a lot more information public. So I think one of the key things that you might consider doing now is perhaps also just bullet pointing. These are the do's and don'ts when it comes to social media during working from an office remotely. That's another policy or document to consider. When you work from home, these are the do's and don'ts, and include the social media side in there. Okay, I think we can allow for a few more questions, but I know we need to start wrapping up. Is there benefit in anticipating a crisis and including that in your policy? Absolutely. So that's where your scenario planning comes in, where you identify key crisis scenarios, be it something that's going to be massive with a massive reputational risk, or something that's not as major, big catastrophe, and then determining for each of those specific categories, how best are we going to communicate that. Okay, regarding companies that are groups and obviously have group governance structures, what is the best way to do crisis communication given the different jurisdictions, right? So that is also one of the key things that you would need to discuss during those different boards and those different meetings to confirm this is our crisis, this is what we can and can't, this is who's responsible for it, and then discuss that per specific scenario. Okay, I think I'll take 2 more questions. There's so many questions here. What I am going to do, I would love to answer each one of these, but that time isn't on our side. I'll get a copy of all of these questions and I'll happily reply to them. I'll also share my email address. Actually, I'll do that. I'm just quickly going to go on to that next slide. If I can, I'll go to the last slide. There's my email address. If you want to pop me an email as well, please feel free to do that and I'll respond to it. So I just want to set 2 more questions and then I will respond to the rest. This has just been such a great session. So thank you everybody for these wonderful questions and interaction. Because of the uncertainty faced in trying to be consistent and also being compassionate, what is the best way to assure the employees about their future? Is it to, oh, sorry, I've answered that one, sorry. Bonus, but 2 more. Many organizations are worried about their bottom line rather than show compassion and empathy. How do we manage this better as an organization? So that would be one of the key messages. So as a that's why you need somebody to help you manage your communication, be it somebody that's on that you've appointed within your organization to do the stakeholder management, to be the communications manager, or investing in a communications and PR firm to help you with the key messages. That would be one of the key things that would need to be in the messages, to also help you to nudge, to say, you know, just to remind you to be compassionate and empathetic. Because I think that's often very much the case. Organizations are numbers driven, are worried about the bottom line now more than ever. But now more than ever as well, we're dealing with people with massive uncertainty from a health point of view and from a work security point of view. So that is really just finding that balance between the 2. If you are able to get accuracy when fact checking, do you assume or do nothing? Tanya, that's a really good question, and there's a lovely diagram doing the rounds. If you don't have the facts and if you can't prove the facts and you're uncertain about the facts, don't share it. So then don't do anything. So unless you know specifically where that facts come from, you just don't do anything. In a general scenario, if you can't accurately give facts, then don't communicate. Don't communicate on something that you don't have the information on. Right, so I think that pretty much brings us to the end of the session. So I really appreciate your time and these wonderful, wonderful comments and the great questions. As I say, I wish I had could get through a few more. And yeah, so my email is there. If you want to pop me an email, regin@reputationmatters.co.za. There's also a event satisfaction survey, which will pop up. So if you can also just complete that survey at the end of this session, that would really, really be great. So thank you so much, everybody, for your time. And yeah, have a wonderful day. Good luck with the lockdown. Keep safe and keep healthy. And I look forward to hearing from you.